The 9,542nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. I should like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Council to His Excellency Mr. Nicolas de Rivière, Permanent Representative of France, for his service as President of the Council for the month of January. I am sure I speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador de Rivière and his team for the great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Iraq, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Madam President. As we are all too aware, the tensions that have engulfed multiple countries in the Middle East continue to rise. Tragically, this comes as no surprise. The Secretary General has repeatedly warned about the risks of further escalation and miscalculation in the region since the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel on 7 October and the devastating Israeli counteroffensive in Gaza. Since early October 2023, we have witnessed near-daily incidents in the region. These include some 165 attacks on United States facilities in Syria and Iraq, prompting U.S. strikes in the two countries. Then, on 28 January, a drone attack killed 3 U.S. service members and injured 40 at a U.S. base known as Tower 22 in northeast Jordan near Al-Tanf base in Syria. On 2 February, the U.S. Central Command said it had carried out 85 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria against reported Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds forces, and affiliated groups. Syria and Iraq condemned the 2 February strikes, with both governments claiming they had resulted in deaths and injured civilians. The United States said it had targeted command and control operations, intelligence centers, and weapons facilities, among other sites, and that it was not seeking conflict in the Middle East or elsewhere. While the Iraqi government has continued to repeat its commitment to protecting U.S. and coalition forces inside Iraq, some armed factions linked to the Islamic resistance in Iraq have pledged to continue their attacks against U.S. and coalition forces in the region. Madam President, the wave of violence since early October involves a large swath of the Middle East. The Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah, along with other groups in Lebanon, have exchanged fire across the blue line on almost daily basis since 8 October. There have been repeated rocket fire over the occupied Golan between Israel and militias reportedly linked to Iran, as well as airstrikes attributed to Israel by the government of Syria on multiple locations in Syria. Ongoing Houthi drone and missile attacks and threats to navigation in the Red Sea are deeply worrying and risk both exacerbating the conflict and further impacting international trade as companies divert ships away from critical maritime routes. A report on Houthi attacks on merchant and commercial vessels in the Red Sea will be shortly before the accordance with Resolution 2720. Since 11 January, the United States and the United Kingdom, backing of 6 other member states, have launched strikes on Houthi positions in Yemen. Strikes have occurred consecutively over the last 3 days. More than 36 targets across 13 locations were reportedly struck on 3 February, including what was described as underground storage facilities, command and control sites, UAV storage and operations sites, radars, and helicopters. The launch site was reportedly hit on 4 February. Sites in Hodeidah, including some very close to United Nations on the ground. President, I reiterate the Secretary General's call on all parties to step back from the brink, consider the unbearable human cost of a potential regional. It's been nearly since more than 12 were killed in the attacks by Hamas, with over 250 in hostage. As the Secretary General said, this has been a period of heartache and anguish for Israelis. And I echo the Secretary General's call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. The past 5 months have also been heartbreaking and catastrophic for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, where hunger is rampant, disease is spreading, and shelter is squalid at best for a vast number of people. The death toll in the Strip is reported to have surpassed 27,000, mostly women and children. Thousands more are reported missing. The civilian population of Gaza should not pay for the terror unleashed by Hamas. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The risk of escalation in the Middle East and its potential consequences was obvious from 7 October. A quick survey of the agenda of this Council explains why. The UN is supporting political and peace processes throughout the region, in countries emerging or still suffering from armed conflict. The Middle East remains highly volatile. Long-term regional stability demands the implementation of a clear political roadmap in each of these situations. The Secretary General continues his extensive outreach to all key stakeholders to urge all parties to take concrete measures to de-escalate tensions and to work towards sustainable political solutions that aim to resolve, rather than merely manage, long-standing conflicts. I appeal to the Council to continue to actively engage all concerned parties to prevent further escalation and the worsening of tensions that undermine regional peace and security. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
President, we would like to thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. We heard quite a lot of heuristics from her, but we didn't hear the main thing from her. Of course, a condemnation of a violation of international law by the United States and the UK. We'd like to thank the Guyanese presidency for swiftly convening today's meeting of the UN Security Council under threats to international peace and security, which we initiated in order to discuss another unlawful and irresponsible act of the United States in the region of the Middle East against the backdrop of an escalation of violence in the Palestinian-Israel conflict zone with an unprecedented number of casualties, in support of which Washington is playing far from a secondary role. On the night from the 2nd to the 3rd of February, the US, using 4 tactical bombers of the US Air Force, F-16s, and 2 supersonic strategic bombers, B-1B Lancers, carried out, by order of President Joe Biden, no less than 85 so-called retaliation strikes on the territory of sovereign Iraq and Syria. The mass airstrikes of American air forces, as a result of which civilians and soldiers died, caused the destruction and damage of tens of facilities. And this demonstrates once again to the entire world the aggressive nature of US policy in the Middle East and their full disregard of Washington for norms of international law. The participation in the US attacks of the UK RAF should give no one the illusion that there is some sort of international coalition in place. London still has to respond for its zealous support of serious provocational attacks of its big brother in Washington, and also the ongoing attacks against Yemen. The actions of the Anglo-Saxons pose a direct threat to international peace and security. They undermine the world order based on the primacy of universal international law and the central role of the United Nations. Perhaps this kind of mob-like action is part of the so-called rules-based order. And in its recent interview, the former Australian ambassador to Iran, John Lender, said it is, and I quote, a set of ever-changing, ever-shifting rules developed by the United States in the interests of the United States and their Western allies, end of quote, adding that, quote, one of the hardest things in the rules-based order is identifying what the rules are, end of quote. Inasmuch the US and its allies benefit from this order, and they advocate for it, using it to justify including their strikes in Iraq and Syria, it's becoming ever clearer that this has very little to this American legal construct has little to do with international law. President, it's clear that American airstrikes are specifically, deliberately aimed to stoke the conflict, and that they targeted positions of the Syrian Arab Republic army in the east of the country, mainly in the province of Deir ez-Zor, where the Syrian army continue to fight against the remaining ISIL fighters who Washington, through their statements, are covering for and tutoring. There are endlessly attacking in recent times targets allegedly of pro-Iran groups in Iraq and Syria. The US is trying to expand this regional conflict to biggest countries in the Middle East. At the same time, the US Central Command representative saying that the so-called operation was coordinated with the authorities of Iraq. However, in the statement of the Iraqi authorities, the US activities were called another brazen aggression and a violation of the sovereignty of Iraq. And the information of Washington on alleged coordination of strikes with Baghdad is a deliberate lie focused on skewing public opinion and shirking legal responsibility. It's clear that the presence of the international anti-ISIL coalition led by the US in the Republic has been a threat to security and stability in the country, and also attempt to involve it in regional and international conflicts. Washington, enjoying its impunity, continues to sow chaos and destruction in the Middle East. The biggest air operation of the US in the region since 2003, presented by Joe Biden as an act of retaliation for an attack of the use of UAVs of unconfirmed origin on the American base that is illegally in Syria, has no justification. We see in these attempts to flex muscles, mainly to try and implement the domestic political situation in America, to justify and salvage the image of the current American administration in the international arena in the light of the upcoming and presidential pre-election campaign. And also the fact that these acts could lead to a further escalation of international tensions and led to the deaths of civilians is not of concern to Washington strategists. President, the recent events confirm that the US is not looking for and has never sought in reality a solution to the problems in the region. The logic of their actions should be found only in their efforts at any price to preserve their dominating position in the world. Therefore, Washington has tried and will continue to try to fight fire with fire and compound the chronic disagreements in the Middle East to such an extent where it is a benefit for their Israeli ally. Trusting on any good sense from the American establishment and the readiness to take into account the interests of the countries in the region is something that is pointless. On the 2nd and the 3rd of February, we were able to see this once again. We decisively condemn this new brazen act of aggression of the US against a sovereign state, creating further risks and increasing the level of instability and in a region that is already on fire. And it is clear that this incident, which we are here discussing today, only increases regional tensions caused by unprecedented violence in Gaza, which for 4 months has been suffering from an inhumane, bloody operation of Israel, who the US is covering through all their efforts, as well as their satellites, including blocking efforts of the Security Council to impose an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Ultimately, we can clearly see that escalation of violence has already gone far beyond the occupied Palestinian territories, crossing not only the border between Israel and Lebanon, but also into the Red Sea and Yemen. It's clear that unilateral acts of violence by Washington and their allies only worsen the chaos in the region, nullifying international efforts to re-establish peace in the Middle East and to find a just solution to the Palestinian question. We call on the international community to unequivocally condemn these senseless acts of Washington and its allies in the Middle East, which violate the sovereignty of Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for convening this meeting. We also want to thank USG DiCarlo for our informative briefing. We welcome the participation of the permanent representatives of Syria, Iran, and Iraq to this meeting. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the recent developments in the Middle East, with the killing of 3 U.S. military personnel in Jordan on Sunday, 28 January 2024. In this regard, we strongly condemn the unprovoked attacks on and killing of the 3 U.S. military personnel. The attacks have led to retaliatory airstrikes by the United Nations against targets in Iraq and Syria. While we note the UN Charter provision on the right to self-defense, which is available to member states of the United Nations to respond to such unprovoked attacks, we urge for a measured response in line with international law. We particularly call for calm and de-escalation from all parties involved in order not to escalate tensions or further jeopardize the stability of the region. The attack on U.S. personnel and the subsequent response has a potential to further escalate or be used as a pretext to escalate ongoing conflicts in the region. There cannot be any justification for the unprovoked attacks and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. With that said, war in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis looms large in the region. In this vein, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza and for dialogue by all the relevant stakeholders in the region in order to avoid further military escalation. We urge all parties to prioritize the well-being of civilians and to pursue the escalation through diplomatic and peaceful resolution. Madam President, our call for de-escalation is to avoid a spillover of the conflict in Gaza to the wider Middle East region. As alluded to already, there are serious incidents in the Red Sea and Yemen, as well as rising tensions in the Israel and Lebanon border. In light of these recent developments, Sierra Leone urgently calls on relevant stakeholders and parties to work with the UN in the spirit of cooperation, humanity, and diplomacy to prevent further deterioration in the humanitarian and security situation in the Middle East region. In conclusion, Sierra Leone calls for de-escalation and a renewed commitment to the principles of international law, peaceful conflict resolution, and avoidance of taking actions that could further worsen insecurity and human suffering. Collectively, let us strive to promote stability and enduring peace in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank Under Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing. We welcome the presence of the representative of Iraq and Syria at today's meeting. I look forward to further details from their statements later in the meeting. The recent U.S. airstrikes on multiple locations in Syria and Iraq have caused heavy casualties. Those acts constitute a grave violation of the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria and Iraq. The United States has indicated that relevant military operations will continue. China expresses its serious concern over this situation. We oppose any acts that violate the UN Charter and infringe upon the territorial sovereignty and security of other countries. As we speak, the situation in the Middle East is on the verge of extreme peril. Easing tensions and preventing the escalation of conflicts are pressing tasks facing the international community. Confronted with this complex situation, we must be clear on the following questions. Who is creating threats, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere? Who is engaged in the excessive use of force, and who is misleading public opinion? On those issues, we must respect facts, uphold justice, and abide by principles. It is simply not right to let the loudest voice set the tone, or let the strongest fist have the final say. In fact, everything that has unfolded recently has already revealed the true answers. Now, with respect to the topic under discussion, the United States claims that its actions were in response to the attacks on the U.S. military and for safeguarding its own security. Iraq and Syria, however, have already voiced strong rejection and condemnation. The U.S. purports that it does not seek to create conflicts in the Middle East or anywhere else, but in reality, it does precisely the opposite. The U.S. military actions are undoubtedly stoking new turmoil in this region and further intensifying tensions. History has repeatedly shown that military means is not a solution, and that the excessive use of force will only lead to bigger crises. The U.S. actions will certainly exacerbate the vicious cycle of tit-for-tat violence in the Middle East. We have witnessed too many examples and precedents in this regard. We urge relevant parties to remain calm, exercise restraint, earnestly abide by the Charter of the United Nations and international law, respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries, cease illegal military operations, and prevent regional situation from further escalation or even spiraling out of control. It must be pointed out that underneath the rising tensions in the Middle East over the past few months, the fundamental reason is the failure to implement a ceasefire in Gaza. China has repeatedly emphasized that an immediate ceasefire in Gaza is a critical, overriding prerequisite for everything else, and a top priority for international diplomatic efforts. All parties should heed the strong call and overwhelming consensus of the international community and support the Security Council in taking strong actions to promote an immediate ceasefire, save lives, alleviate humanitarian catastrophes, and contain any spillover of the conflict. We call on the country concerned to demonstrate political will and determination, take more practical actions to safeguard regional peace and stability, make less selfish geopolitical calculations, and play a constructive role that is expected of it. Madam President, today's world is becoming increasingly dangerous, and international peace and security are facing grave challenges. We are now standing at a critical crossroads. At stake is the fate and future of our world. China believes that In a world facing interlocking changes and chaos, we must uphold the sense of a community with a shared future for mankind and fully recognize that all countries have a shared destiny and an interdependent future. We are all in the same boat. The security of one country cannot be achieved at the expense of that of others. All countries must stay committed to maintaining common security, achieving common development, and building a common future. We must adhere to true multilateralism, preserve the core role of the United Nations, build a multipolar world with equality and order, promote an inclusive and universal preferential economic globalization, and jointly build a world of lasting peace and universal security. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I would like to congratulate you and Guyana for presiding over the Council during February. And I assure you about Algeria's full support. Let me also say our admiration to the Ambassador de Rivière and his able team for the successful chairmanship of the Security Council last month. Our appreciation goes to Madame Di Carlo for her insightful briefing. The Middle East stands at the precipice of collapse. The recent airstrike targeting Iraq and Syria over the weekend are likely to further exacerbate the already precarious situation. It may potentially lead toward a further escalation. And in this context, we reaffirm our steady support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of both Iraq and Syria. The brotherly people of Syria and Iraq deserve to live in peace and prosperity. Madam President, in light of these critical circumstances, we urge for restraint and avoidance of any escalation. The region cannot bear the burden of additional tensions, and we firmly believe that force is not and will never be the means for peace and stability. History attests that force only causes ruin, instability, and fosters animosity. Today, we advocate for dialogue and collective action to bridge differences and foster shared prosperity. Let us set aside notion of violence, deterrence, or punishment, and let us work hand in hand toward an appeased Middle East. Madam President, genuine stability in the Middle East necessitates a comprehensive addressing of the root causes that underpin instability. We must invest in long-term solutions to prevent further suffering and pave the way for lasting peace in the region. The Palestinian question stands as the cornerstone for this endeavor. From the outset of aggression against the Palestinian people, particularly in the Gaza Strip, my country, Algeria, on many occasions sounded the alarm on the risk of regional spillover. Regrettably, the situation has evolved into a devastating reality, compelling us to redouble our effort to halt the escalation across the entire region. The peoples of this region, like all inhabitants in the world, yearn for peace, yearn for development, and yearn for prosperity. It is high time for this cradle of civilization to reclaim its stability. The initial stride toward this goal lies in an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Under-Secretary General De Carlo, for your briefing. The United Kingdom fully supports all efforts to maintain and enhance international peace and security, including in Iraq and Syria. We are committed to de-escalating tensions in the Middle East. We condemn the multiple attacks since October 2023 by Iran-aligned militant groups against the global coalition and Iraqi military bases in Syria and Iraq. Despite warnings, those strikes have continued and intensified, with an attack on the 26th of January killing 3 American personnel and injuring many more. We fully support the US right to self-defense and their right to respond. Daesh continue to pose a grave threat to those countries and to the wider region, and conducted its biggest attack in years last month in Iran. Its ability to direct, enable, and inspire attacks continues to represent one of the most significant global terrorist threats. And the sole objective of the global coalition, of which the UK is a leading member, is to counter Daesh. The UK remains committed to working with our counter-terror partners in Iraq and Syria to tackle the threat from Daesh and to prevent their resurgence. President, Iran's political, financial, and military support to militant groups is destabilizing the region and threatens our collective ability to counter Daesh. So we call on the regime to rein in these groups and to act now to prevent further attacks by its proxies and partners in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. As I said earlier, we are committed to de-escalation of regional tension. President, the Houthis' continued attacks on commercial and military vessels in the Red Sea are illegal and unacceptable. This Council was clear in Resolution 2722 that we condemn Houthi attacks and call on them to stop. This Council has supported international efforts to enhance protection of shipping in the Red Sea. Our actions and presence in the Red Sea are designed to protect innocent lives, preserve freedom of navigation, and deter further attacks on shipping. We acted alongside our US allies and with the support of many international partners in self-defense and in accordance with the rule of law. We are committed to working with all members of this Council and the international community to protect international peace and security in the Middle East and throughout the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Allow me to thank Ambassador de Rivière for France's chairmanship of the Security Council for the month of January. I also wish to convey Malta's support to Guyana for your presidency for this month. I thank USG De Carlo for her briefing. As we have stated on various occasions, the situation in the Middle East remains deeply concerning. We are also deeply troubled about the fact that instability in the Middle East is being exploited by militias and armed groups to engage in activities that continue to compound this difficult and fragile context. The rapidly deteriorating maritime security situation in the Red Sea is a case in point. We reiterate our call on the Houthis to immediately cease any attacks and underline the need to avoid any further escalations as outlined in Resolution 2722. The navigational rights and freedoms of commercial vessels in the Red Sea is of paramount importance. These rights must be respected and assured. President, on this occasion, we urge all parties to combat the malign influence of all bad actors and to refrain from actions which could contribute to a wider war. The importance of protecting civilian lives remains paramount. The international community and this Council must focus on rapidly working towards addressing the root causes of the region's tensions and promote avenues towards a just and lasting peace based on relevant UN resolutions and international law. Acts of terrorism have often been used to exacerbate tensions, and we simply cannot allow that the current very tense situation is disrupted by people not operating in good faith. We believe that the UNSC has a key role to play in this regard, and we will continue to support initiatives to hold these spoilers to account. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Undersecretary General De Carlo, for your briefing. Colleagues, on February 2nd, and at President Biden's direction, the United States conducted precision airstrikes on February 2 in Iraq and Syria against Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated militia groups. This necessary and proportionate action was taken in exercise of the United States' inherent right of self-defense as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Less than a week ago, on January 28, Iran-aligned militia groups in Iraq attacked a Jordanian facility hosting U.S. forces taking part in the fight against ISIS-Daesh. 3 U.S. service members lost their lives that day, and many others were wounded. This loss is devastating. This is unacceptable, and attacks like it cannot continue. Colleagues, Russia called this meeting under the false pretense that the United States has no ground to respond to attacks that have killed U.S. personnel. It bears repeating, therefore, that the actions U.S. forces took on February 2 are necessary and proportionate, consistent with international law, and in exercise of the United States' inherent right to self-defense. We also repeatedly stated in previous letters to this Council that the United States would take further action to respond to future attacks or threats of attack against U.S. nationals and U.S. personnel and facilities. These recent strikes certainly fall into that category. They are aimed at protecting and defending U.S. personnel, including those in Jordan, who are supporting operations against ISIS to ensure the terrorist group can never resurge. The strike successfully degraded the capabilities of Iranian-backed militias, deterring and undermining their ability to conduct further attacks. The facilities struck included command and control operations and intelligence centers, rockets, missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicle storage, and logistics and munition supply chain facilities. The IRGC and affiliated militias have used these facilities to attack U.S. and coalition forces. These targets were carefully selected to avoid civilian casualties and based on clear, irrefutable evidence that they were connected to attacks on U.S. personnel in the region. President Biden has made clear that these strikes were the start of our response to the deadly attack on Tower 22 in northeastern Jordan. I also want to stress that these strikes are separate and distinct from the coalition strikes in Yemen, which were in response to the Iranian-backed Houthis' lawless attacks on naval vessels and international shipping in the Red Sea. Let me be clear. The United States does not desire more conflict in a region when we are actively working to contain and de-escalate the conflict in Gaza. And we are not seeking a direct conflict with Iran. But we will continue to defend our personnel against unacceptable attacks, period. The U.S. and coalition forces are deployed in our shared effort to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. As we've reported in numerous letters to the Security Council President, since October 18, Iran-aligned militia groups have attacked those forces in Iraq, Syria, and now Jordan over 165 times. 165 times. Iran has provided support for many of these attacks, which were similar to the one on January 28. Many of them have resulted in casualties, including among our Iraqi partners. The United States has repeatedly, and in some instances directly, warned Iran about attacks on U.S. personnel. And yet, Iran has failed to rein in its extremist proxies. On the contrary, Iran continues to escalate tensions across the region by enabling these proxies' deadly attacks. Iran cannot deny its role in enabling these attacks against U.S. forces or its responsibility for this escalation. And so, we call on every member of this Council, and especially those with direct channels to Iran, to press Iran's leaders to rein in their militias and stop these attacks. They should also press the Syrian regime to stop giving Iran a platform to destabilize the region. Colleagues, as President Biden has made clear, we will not hesitate to defend our personnel and hold responsible all those who harm Americans. That certainly goes for Iran and its proxies. And so we will continue to exercise our right to self-defense at a time and a place of our choosing. And we will continue to hold Iran and its affiliates accountable for their destabilizing actions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her timely briefing. At the outset, my delegation expresses its serious concern about the regional escalation since the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas and Israel's subsequent military operations in the Gaza Strip. Houthis have continued their indiscriminate attacks on merchant and commercial vessels, jeopardizing the free flow of commerce in the Red Sea. The saber-rattling situation across the blue line between Israel and Lebanon is ongoing. Further destabilizing this combustible situation, militant groups in Iraq and Syria have launched a series of attacks against the U.S. and coalition forces in the region. Even the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad was targeted by such rocket attacks in December of last year, and these attacks have led to U.S. forces strikes in response. We call on militant groups in the region to cease their provocative actions, which undermine regional security and stability. In this regard, we take note of the measures taken by the U.S. to limit the risk of escalation in defending their personnel and the facilities. Simultaneously, we note with appreciation that relevant parties in the region have expressed their willingness to avoid an escalation of conflict. Madam President, over the last weekend, the U.S. and U.K. conducted military operations in response to the continued threats posed by the Houthis, despite the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2722, urging the Houthis to stop their attacks in the Red Sea. The situation in Israel and Gaza remains grave, carrying high risk of spillover to other parts of the region. Above all, or at this volatile moment, when miscalculation can unintendedly lead to a tinderbox, any attempts to politically exploit the situation and risk regional stability are unacceptable. What is needed at this juncture is to focus on and support diplomacy to enhance regional security and foster safer trade and flow of energy. In recent years, we have witnessed significant achievements in the political and security areas made by the Iraqi people, and these achievements need to be upheld and expanded. At the same time, as the current security and humanitarian situation in Syria remain extremely dire, the UN and humanitarian agencies' engagement should be ramped up to deliver life-saving humanitarian assistance. We also echo the Iraqi government's statement that the recent regional developments not only jeopardize the global economy but also undermine regional efforts to combat ISIS. We must not forget the unthinkable terror and the cataclysm that ISIS inflicted on the region from 2014. We vividly saw that ISIS threats remain ongoing as they claim the responsibility for the deadly bombing in the city of Kerman, Iran last month. The risk of resurgence of ISIS still remains in the region, as the Secretary General assessed in his latest report. In this connection, the recent attacks of militant groups against the U.S. and coalition forces threaten to undermine the ongoing efforts to combat ISIS in the region. In conclusion, the Republic of Korea will make efforts to support diplomacy and prevent far-reaching spillover in the region and beyond. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. We take note of the information provided by USG DiCarlo, and we thank her for that information. And we also recognize the presence in this chamber with us of representatives from Syria, Iran, and Iraq. My country is concerned by the escalation of violence in recent weeks in the Middle East. It is a serious threat to international peace and security, and it puts the lives and the physical integrity of the civilian population at risk. The Security Council has a key responsibility in this matter to lay the foundation for sustainable peace in the region. The attacks on the 2nd of February on a number of cities in Iraq and Syria in retaliation for the attack on January 28th in Jordan have cost the lives of dozens of civilians and military personnel. Ecuador would call on all parties to show restraint and reminds them of the need to comply with the provisions of international law, the UN Charter, and relevant resolutions of this Council. Ecuador echoes the Secretary General's appeal for restraint and in urging all parties involved to cease fire and to turn to diplomatic and political means for resolving these differences at this critical juncture. My delegation also encourages any effort aimed at de-escalation of tensions, and we appeal to the parties to abstain from pursuing any action which might further exacerbate the delicate situation in the Middle East. I would conclude, Madam President, by reaffirming the urgent need for us to work together regionally and globally to further combat terrorism, to ensure the protection of civilians, and to make every effort to guarantee access for humanitarian aid. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First, I want to congratulate you, Madam President, and your country, Guyana, for assuming the presidency of the Council for this month. And we have full trust that you'll be our North Star in the difficult discussions that you're going to have in February, and that you'll guide us through the month. I also want to thank France and the Ambassador de Rivière and his team for the leadership that they provided during the month of January. I would also like to thank Undersecretary Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. With each passing day, the situation in the Middle East is becoming more volatile. We have a growing feeling of powerlessness against the increasing spillover of the Gaza conflict into the wider region. The coalition's presence in Iraq is under growing threat from intensified attacks, which could undo the progress achieved in the country. Meanwhile, the situation in Syria is deteriorating with more violence and tension in the northwest and northeast. We are gravely concerned about this cycle of violence that is causing numerous civilian casualties. And we wish to recall that international law must be respected by all, and the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure must be ensured at all times and in any circumstances. We continue to believe that our best hope to stop the spiral of violence, to start restoring calm in the wider region, is to restore calm in Gaza. Call it as you like, but the bombing, the shelling, the killing in Gaza, as well as attacks on Israel, must stop. Hostages must be released, and urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance for Gazans must be restored in full. We urge all actors in the region to exert utmost restraint and to work towards de-escalation, exert influence on non-state groups to do so. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by expressing our appreciation to USG DiCarlo for the informative briefing. I have listened carefully to the explanation by the US on this matter. Japan notes the US stated that it carried out the airstrikes against facilities of Iranian-affiliated militants and other groups in Iraq and Syria following the attack on the US troops in Jordan on January 28th in order to de-escalate the continued attacks by those groups. Japan is also aware that the United States does not seek a wider conflict in the Middle East or elsewhere and acted on this basis. Madam President, tensions in the Middle East are already high and situation on the ground is extremely volatile. The conflict in Gaza, which started on October 7th, has had serious ramifications across the region. In this context, Japan is deeply concerned that a number of non-state armed groups, militias, and terrorists have been launching attacks and have signaled that they will intensify their hostile activities. Those activities cannot be justified for any reason. We call upon all parties to refrain from any kind of destabilizing actions, such as the transfer of weapons, including missiles and UAVs, and other military-related technologies to such non-state actors. Madam President, no one wants to see a continuation of the cycle of violence and increasing civilian casualties. Japan remains committed to making every effort in close cooperation with fellow Council members and other key stakeholders to restore security and stability and find sustainable solutions that can stop the fighting in the region. Our world is at crossroads. We must choose the path toward peace, not war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci.
Thank you, President. As this is the first open meeting of this month, I would like to assure you of the full support of Switzerland for your presidency, and I would also like to congratulate France on their successful presidency last month. We would like to thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing detailing developments in the region. Switzerland is concerned about the escalation that has been taking place in the region since the start of hostilities in Gaza, and which has reached a dangerous point with the events of the last 10 days. This is not only in Syria and Iraq, but also along the Blue Line and in the Red Sea. There is, in the region, a real risk to international peace and security. We call on all parties and those with influence over them to exercise maximum restraint to avoid further escalation. When this is about a question of the use of force, any action must strictly comply with international law. In addition, all channels of communication must be used to avoid misunderstandings. A single miscalculation can have disastrous consequences. It is vital to calm the situation in order to achieve a regional de-escalation as quickly as possible. Only political solutions can bring peace and security to the whole region. In particular, a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza is necessary. In Syria, Switzerland recalls that Resolution 2254 calls for a national ceasefire. As for Iraq, the situation will be discussed tomorrow when it is on the Council's agenda. Finally, we call on all parties to respect international law, in particular international humanitarian law and human rights. In conclusion, I would like to stress once again that this Council must play its full role in helping to de-escalate the situation and to find political solutions to the conflicts in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I would like to express my delegation's full support for your presidency throughout February. I thank Ms. Di Carlo for her briefing. France is quite concerned by the current escalation in the Middle East. The January 28th strikes, which targeted American military personnel fighting Daesh on the Syrian-Jordanian border, are unacceptable. They undermine the collective efforts against this terrorist group and threaten stability in the entire region by stoking further a worrying escalation of violence. France has condemned these attacks, and we express our full solidarity with the United States. We have been committed alongside the United States since 2024, and we will remain so to combat the scourge of terrorism along with countries in the region. Since 2014, France is committed to combating Daesh, in particular along with its partners from the international coalition. In Iraq, France will continue to support the Iraqi authorities' efforts to combat terrorism as long as they request that support in full respect of Iraqi sovereignty. We are committed to the security and stability of Iraq and of the autonomous region of Kurdistan within that country. We condemned the attack by armed drones against Kurdish forces bases in December, as well as the strikes on the 15th of January in Erbil claimed by the IRGC. These actions are a violation of Iraqi sovereignty and must cease. In Syria, we are deeply concerned by the rise in violence on all fronts. The primary victims are civilians in the northeast and in the west, in particular in Idlib, as well as in the area controlled by the regime. These hostilities must cease in accordance with resolutions of this Council. There will be no possibility for a just and lasting solution in Syria until a credible and inclusive political process has been undertaken on the basis of Resolution 2254, adopted unanimously by this Council. France calls on all parties to show restraint in Iraq and in Syria. We must do everything possible to avoid a regional spillover. We must urgently seek out together the means to ensure a sustained decline of tensions. Those with an influence on groups threatening stability in the region must use this influence to put an end to escalation and find the path to peace in the region, from Yemen to Lebanon, including Iraq and Syria. Iran has a serious responsibility in this regard. We continue to warn it about any regional attempts at escalation and would call on it immediately to cease its destabilizing activities. France will continue for its part to work to prevent a regional spillover. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique thanks Guyana Presidency for convening this urgent meeting. We are grateful to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, for her insights on this topic under consideration. Madam President, the situation in the Middle East has been addressed by this Council on many occasions. Today, we come here deeply concerned over the recent developments in the region that include military confrontations that threaten peace and security, not just in the region, but also in the entire world. The recent retaliatory attacks in Yemen, Syria, Iraq are such an example. They aggravate the current cycle of confrontation and war that already prevails in the region. These attacks are likely to escalate tensions with negative spillover effects in the entire Middle East and beyond. It is our view that at all times, member states are bound by the Charter of the United Nations that compels them to settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that peace and security and justice are not endangered. These attacks took place at a time when the USA, Qatar, Egypt were engaged in diplomatic contacts with the aim to end the devastating and the bloody war between Israel and Hamas. In this connection, we echo the UN Secretary General's viewpoint that as the hostilities between Israel and Hamas and other groups in Gaza intensify, there is a risk for further spillover of this conflict with devastating consequences to the entire region. Faced with mounting tensions in the Middle East, it is important for all parties involved to urgently de-escalate the tension, avoid armed confrontation, and engage in a meaningful, responsible, constructive dialogue and work towards peaceful long-term solution. We need to promote a solution that addresses the root causes of the prevailing conflict in the region. As Security Council, our mandate requires us to pull together our efforts in that direction by following the path of dialogue and diplomacy so as to achieve peace and stability in the region and in the world. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. I would like to thank USG DiCarlo for the information provided. We value the assessment of the UN and welcome the organization's continued monitoring of the situation. I also acknowledge the presence of the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, and the Syrian Arab Republic. My delegation is gravely concerned about the precarious situation prevailing in the Middle East and the potential for a wider regional conflagration. Such a risk must concern us all. Guyana condemns the attacks that resulted in the deaths of the 3 U.S. servicemen. We are concerned at reports of civilian losses in the response that has ensued. We consider it important that no effort be spared to avert new threats and provocations that could further inflame tensions in a region already besieged by conflict and a worsening humanitarian crisis. Guyana urges due caution in responding to these challenges. We call upon all parties to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. We urge due respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Guyana further considers that this Council must not relent in the search for solutions to the current security challenges in the region, not least the situation in Gaza, nor in efforts to avert a broader destabilizing regional conflict. In that regard, Guyana reiterates its call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, where unprecedented numbers of Palestinians have been killed since October 7. The Council must unite to bring peace to Palestine and Israel and an end to this human tragedy. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you on Guyana's election as member of the Security Council and on your presidency for this month. We wish you success in this endeavor. My delegation thanks the permanent delegation of the Russian Federation for requesting this urgent meeting in response to the vicious aggression committed by the U.S. administration against the territories of the Syrian Arab Republic and the Brotherly Republic of Iraq at dawn on Saturday. This aggression constitutes a threat to regional and international peace and security and a blatant violation of international law, international humanitarian law, and the principles and purposes of the United Nations. Therefore, it should be condemned and denounced by the Security Council. Madam President, the U.S. aggression led to the martyrdom of 37 civilians and military personnel and seriously injured 34 others. It led to the destruction of several civilian residential buildings, a school, and many civilian vehicles and facilities. Even historical sites were not spared from this aggression, which also targeted the ancient Al-Raba citadel. We have heard today the same flimsy pretexts and misleading claims that the U.S. administration is promoting in an attempt to justify its repeated attacks, including by presenting a distorted and wrongful interpretation of the UN Charter's provisions, especially Article 51, ignoring the fact that occupation has no right to self-defense and that the root causes of conflicts, suffering, and instability in our region are the wrongful policies and the destructive policies of the United States and its blind and unlimited support for the Israeli occupation entity and the atrocities committed by Israel, including the ongoing crime of genocide against the Palestinian people for more than 120 days, alongside with the U.S. investment in terrorism by supporting Daesh and al-Nusra Front Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other terrorist groups and separatist militias, as well as spreading chaos and destruction. Madam President, through its statements and official letters, my government has been keen to urge the Security Council to uphold its responsibilities regarding the repeated acts of aggression and serious violations of international law committed by the United States against the sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, and the independence of the Syrian Arab Republic. Of course, one statement before the Security Council is not enough to list all the U.S. violations. Successive U.S. administrations have misused their permanent membership of the Security Council and interfered thoroughly in the internal affairs of other countries, including my country, Syria. They have formed military coalitions outside the umbrella of the United Nations and international legitimacy, perpetrating acts of aggression and occupation, exerting pressure and blackmail, collectively punishing and smothering peoples with unilateral coercive measures and inhumane, immoral blockades. Such violations impose the law of force over the force of law. Unfortunately, the successive U.S. administrations have obstructed the work of the Security Council and prevented the Security Council from carrying out its primary responsibility entrusted to it by member states to maintain international peace and security. These administrations have guaranteed that their agents in our region, including the Israeli occupation authorities, terrorist organizations, and militias, will continue to commit the most heinous crimes with impunity. Madam President, the Syrian Arab Republic completely rejects all the pretexts and lies that the U.S. administration is trying to use to justify its aggression, which aims to protect its agents in the region, including Daesh and al-Nusra Front, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, other terrorist entities and groups associated with them, and the separatist militias. These agents would not have continued their crimes against the Syrian people without the multifaceted support provided by the United States and its allies to them. Syria also categorically rejects that the territories of member states and the blood of their people become a platform for American election campaigns and for displaying brute force that undermine the values of law and justice and the principle of collective security on which the United Nations was founded. Syria affirms that this vicious American aggression, which is accompanied by the repeated Israeli attacks against the Syrian territories and the crimes of terrorist organizations and separatist militias, will not deter Syria from continuing its quest by all legitimate means to liberate its entire territories from the illegal foreign military presence, to eliminate terrorism, to restore the state authority and rule of law over its entire territories, and to ensure the security and well-being of the Syrian people. In conclusion, Madam President, my country asks the U.S. administration to abandon its erroneous and destructive policies in the region and to end its illegal military presence on the Syrian territories, to end the suffering it is causing to Syrians as a result of its inhumane coercive measures, the plundering of national wealth, and the support it provides to terrorist organizations and separatist militias. My country also stresses that the U.S. administration must refrain from causing further escalation in our region at a time when the overwhelming majority of the UN member states are working to stop war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide that the Israeli occupation authorities are committing against the Palestinian people, as well as Israel's repeated attacks on the Syrian Arab Republic and other Arab territories. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
Shukran jazilan.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Security Council, first of all, I would like to congratulate Ambassador Carolina Rodriguez, permanent representative of Guyana, and congratulate her on the presidency this month. We'd like to thank France for their efforts last month as President of the Council. We would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo also for her briefing during this session. We appreciate the call for a Security Council meeting to be held today at this specific time in the Middle East, because Iraq is aware that the crises in the Middle East are linked. We have already cautioned against escalation and said that the recent evolution of the situation could have grave repercussions and could undermine regional international peace and security. President, Iraq, in its foreign policy, carries out a balanced policy on the basis of solid relations with the regional environment and also the international community to ensure its natural role as a leader in the region around the world. This approach is reflected in the regional and international opening of Iraq. Over the last 2 years, Iraq has been working to become a source and a factor of stability in the regional and international context, and its relations with all states and states in the region should be balanced and based on the principles of good neighborliness, mutual respect for interference and non-interference in internal affairs, and respect for sovereignty. We underscore the importance of not exporting domestic problems of states abroad, because this jeopardizes stability and security in the region and also jeopardizes its economic situation. Thus, Iraq, through its pragmatic diplomacy, has been able to bridge differences and ensure rapprochement between different positions in the region. President, Iraq is intermediately suffering from allied, friendly and neighboring countries' attacks. It is surprising that relations between the Iraqi government and these states and their governments are being privileged. However, these attacks, which undermine Iraq's sovereignty, security and territories, are not in line with the nature and level of these relations. While we reaffirm our concern to protect and strengthen these bilateral relations, we condemn and categorically reject any attack against several areas in Iraqi territory, which have led to losses of human life as well as injuries amongst civilians, and it has damaged public and private property for futile and illogical pretexts. These attacks are violations of Iraqi sovereignty as well as territorial integrity, and it threatens its security and its people, and it runs counter to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Iraq rejects all types of attacks against our military bases and will not allow anyone to impose the conflict that is ravaging the region too. We will not allow Iraqi territory to be used for score settling or for policies to be rolled out. President, Iraq strongly condemns the American attacks which targeted military positions in Iraq on the night of the 3rd of February, and which led to dozens of deaths and martyrs amongst personnel and civilians. This is a grave attack to official Iraqi security authorities, and this is a violation of Iraq's sovereignty as well as its security, and a transgression of the laws that govern relations between states. Lastly, we reiterate the importance for the Council to shoulder its responsibilities for maintaining international peace and security and to protect the sovereignty of states and their territorial integrity, as well as to combat all violations and ensure the respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations.
Iraq for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Madam President, I would like to congratulate Guyana, the newly elected member of the Security Council, for its presidency this month. We acknowledge France for successful completion of its presidency in January. I would also like to extend my congratulations to the other elected members, Algeria, Sierra Leone, Republic of Korea, and Slovenia. We appreciate Russia request for convening this meeting under the agenda item threat to international peace and security, which addresses persistent violation of international law and the UN Charter by the United States in the region. We welcome the presence of Ms. DiCarlo and the Secretary General in this meeting. Madam President, Iran strongly condemns the U.S. military attacks on Syria and Iraq territory. The U.S. military action is illegal and unjustified and blatantly violate the basic norms and principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, particularly paragraph 4 of Article 2 of the Charter. It is also a flagrant breach of Iraq and Syria territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence. Iran also strongly condemns the joint military action of the United States and the United Kingdom against Yemen, which constitute an obvious violation of the United Nations Charters and international law. Furthermore, they have openly abused Security Council Resolution 2722. These illegal actions, which targeted civilians and vital infrastructure, jeopardize regional peace and security, as well as pose a serious threat to international peace and security. The US and UK must bear their international responsibility for their commission of the crime of aggression. The argument of justification invoking Article 51 as a basis for this aggression lacks a solid legal foundation and cannot legitimize these illegal actions. Madam President, today in this chamber, the US and UK made another desperate attempt to distract attention away from the root cause of the current situation in the region by falsely putting the finger and blame on Iran. It is regretful that the United States, a permanent member of the Security Council, has failed to fulfill its obligation under the UN Charter. The US expressed grave concern about the spillover of tension in the region while continuing to play a destabilizing role in the region. The United States continues to occupy Syrian territory, loot Syrian property and resources, and support separatist and terrorist groups. Furthermore, people in Syria are experiencing economic hardship and humanitarian crisis as a result of the United States' hostile and harmful actions, as well as the application of illegal sanctions. All these measures violate international law, the UN Charter, and related Security Council resolutions. The Syrian Arab Republic has officially and frequently raised objections to those violations, calling on the Security Council to halt these violations and put an end to the US occupation. In Iraq, following the unlawful military intervention in 2003, the US and the so-called coalition ignored Iraq's opinion and aspiration and continued illegal activities and presence under the guise of fighting terrorism. The United States and NATO must respect the Iraqi government's decision to terminate their military presence and withdraw their forces from the country. Madam President, all of the resistance groups in the region are independent, and their decisions and actions are motivated by their legitimate rights under international law that are ending the illegal presence of US in their territories, stopping the genocide in Gaza, and ending the occupation of Palestinian territories. Therefore, any attempt to attribute these actions to Iran or its armed forces is misleading, baseless, and unacceptable. Iran never seeks to contribute to the spillover in the region. Iran has no military presence in Iraq, nor does it have bases or military advisors. In Syria, Iranian military advisors are legally present since they were invited officially by the Syrian governments to fight terrorism. Claims that Iran's bases in Iraq and Syria were attacked are rejected as unfounded and regarded as attempts to shift attention away from the US aggressive actions. Iran has never sought to bring this dispute with the United States into Iraq territory and remains committed to Iraq's independence, national sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and this is the principal position of Islamic Republic of Iran. Madam President, it is evident to everyone that the root causes of the current situation in the region are occupation, aggression, and continued genocide and horrific atrocities committed by the Israeli regime and fully supported by the U.S. against innocent Palestinians in Gaza Strip and West Bank. The U.S. military attack against the Muslim nations of the region are the continuation of a complicity of this country in the genocide of the Palestinians through all-out support of the occupying regime and preventing any effective international action to hold the regime accountable. While more than 4 months have passed since the occupying regime's genocidal attacks on the oppressed people of Palestine, the U.S. has not only actively cooperated with the Israeli regime in the genocide of the Palestinians, but it's now attempting to divert the international community's attention away from the genocide of the Palestinians through a spillover and escalation of tension in other parts of the region. We believe that the only solution to end the conflict in the region and prevent the spillover of the war is to return all to their obligation under international law. That is, to force Israel to stop genocide in Gaza, to establish an immediate ceasefire to end the presence of U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, and to exert pressure to end the occupation of Palestinian territory by the Israeli regime. Instead of blaming others and simply urging restraint from other members, the U.S. must force the Israeli regime to halt the genocide in Gaza and comply with its obligation under international humanitarian law. Likewise, the U.S. must end its obstruction of the UN Security Council to allow the adoption of the draft resolution proposed by Algeria, focusing on the ceasefire in Gaza. This approach aligns with the broader goal of restoring peace and stability in the region while addressing the humanitarian concerns at hand. Finally, Madam President, I would like to reiterate that if Iran faces any threat, attack, or aggression affecting its security, national interest, or people, it will not hesitate to exercise its inherent rights under international law and the UN Charter to respond firmly. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.